The war had been raging for 3 cycles when High Commander finally accepted the truth that his people were losing. The Confederacy had stood as a beacon of civilization in this corner of the galaxy for over 10,000 years. They had built cities that touched the clouds and ships that sailed between stars. They had created art and music and philosophy that lesser species could barely comprehend. And now they were being devoured by creatures that knew nothing but hunger and destruction. The swarm had appeared from the void between galaxies like a plague made of teeth and claws. They did not negotiate. They did not trade. They did not even seem to communicate in any way that the scientists could understand. They simply consumed. World after world fell to their endless waves, and for every warrior that died, 10 more seemed to take its place. The fleet was bleeding ships faster than they could build them, and their soldiers were dying faster than they could be trained. Stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Light, and watched the latest battle reports scroll across his display. 12 more colony worlds lost, 47 ships destroyed, nearly 1 million civilians either dead or missing, which in the case of the meant the same thing. His 4 eyes closed slowly as he absorbed the weight of his failure. He had sworn an oath to protect his people, and he was watching them die. His communications officer, a young female named, approached him with hesitation in her steps. She knew better than to disturb the High Commander when he was lost in thought, but her duty demanded it. She informed him that she had sent the distress signal to every known species in the galactic community. She had begged for aid from the Empire, from the Silicate Collective, from the wandering clans of Nexus. The responses had come back one by one. They expressed sympathy, but explained that they could not risk their own borders. The Silicates offered resources but no soldiers. The wandering clans simply did not respond at all. Nodded slowly. He had expected nothing less. The galaxy was vast and cold, and species looked after their own interests first. It was the way of things. He asked if there had been any other responses, expecting her to confirm that there were none. But hesitated. She told him that there was one more response. It came from a small planet on the far edge of the spiral arm, from a species that had only achieved interstellar travel within the last 2 centuries. They called themselves humans. The databases had almost nothing on them. They were considered primitive by galactic standards, barely worth noticing. They were laughably short, their bodies fragile, their technology generations behind the major powers. But they had responded to the distress call. Felt something between amusement and pity. He asked what these humans had said. Pulled up the transmission and played it for him. A human face appeared on the screen, a male with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to carry storms within them. He introduced himself as Commander Collins of the United Earth Defense Force. He spoke in a calm voice that carried an edge of something could not quite identify. Commander Collins said that they had received the distress signal. He said that they understood the Confederacy was facing extinction. He said that humanity would send what forces they could spare. Almost laughed. He asked how many ships these humans were bringing. When she told him 37, he did laugh, though it was a hollow sound. 37 ships against a swarm that numbered in the tens of thousands. It was not reinforcement. It was suicide. But the human commander was not finished speaking. He said that he knew their numbers were small. He said that he knew the probably expected more. But he wanted the High Commander to understand something about his people. Humans had spent their entire history fighting against impossible odds. They had clawed their way up from the mud of their through ice ages and plagues and wars that had killed millions. They had split the atom and walked on their moon and reached for the stars not because it was easy, but because it was hard. They did not come to this fight expecting to win. They came because someone had asked for help. The transmission ended with 3 words that the universal translator struggled to interpret. Fidelis explained that it was an ancient phrase from one of the human languages. It meant always faithful. Stood in silence for a long moment after the transmission ended. His advisors gathered around him, their expressions ranging from dismissive to outright contemptuous. One of them, a senior admiral named, suggested that they politely decline the human offer. He argued that bringing such a primitive species into their conflict would be a waste of resources. They would need to protect the humans rather than fight alongside them. They would be a liability. But something in that human commander's eyes stayed with. There had been no fear there, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that bordered on madness. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who knew they were marching toward death and had made peace with it. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Told his advisors that they would accept the human offer. When protested, the High Commander silenced him with a look. He said that they were in no position to refuse any help, no matter how small. And besides, he found himself curious about these humans. Any species that would travel across the galaxy to fight in a war that was not their own, against an enemy they had never faced, deserved at least the chance to prove themselves. Sent the acceptance message, and the fleet began preparing for the arrival of their new allies. Returned to his quarters and spent the night reading everything the databases had on humanity. It was not much. They were a young species, violent by nature, prone to fighting among themselves almost as much as they fought external threats. Their history was a long catalog of wars and conflicts and atrocities that made even the seem restrained by comparison. But there was something else in those records. Stories of humans who had stood against tyrants when standing meant death. Stories of humans who had sacrificed themselves so that others might live. Stories of humans who had been beaten and broken and left for dead, only to rise again and keep fighting. They called this quality different things in different cultures: stubbornness, determination, spite. But it all amounted to the same thing. Humans did not know when to quit. Closed the database and stared out at the stars. He did not know if these humans would make any difference in the war. 37 ships was nothing against the swarm, but as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he found himself hoping that the humans would prove him wrong. The galaxy had dismissed them as primitive and weak. Perhaps it was time for the galaxy to learn that it had made a terrible mistake. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace on the edge of the staging grounds, and felt his heart sink as he watched them arrive. 37 ships, just as promised, but seeing them in person was somehow worse than he had imagined. They were small by galactic standards, barely larger than patrol craft. Their hulls were and pitted from what looked like decades of hard use. They moved in a loose formation that seemed almost chaotic compared to the precise geometric patterns of the fleet. Admiral stood beside on the observation deck and made no effort to hide his contempt. He pointed out that several of the human ships appeared to be held together with emergency patches. He noted that their weapons' signatures were barely detectable, suggesting armaments that would struggle to scratch the paint on a cruiser. He concluded that bringing these primitives here had been a mistake. Said nothing. He watched as the human flagship, a vessel called the Defiant Hope, maneuvered toward the docking station. The name struck him as oddly fitting. There was something defiant about these humans, arriving in their battered ships to fight a war that had already destroyed civilizations far more advanced than their own. Whether that defiance was courage or foolishness remained to be seen. The docking procedure took longer than expected because the human ships used different connection protocols than the stations. Eventually, a temporary seal was established and made his way to the airlock to greet his new allies personally. Advised against it, suggesting that a junior officer could handle the formalities, but wanted to look these humans in the eye. He wanted to understand what had driven them across the galaxy to die for strangers. The airlock opened and Commander Collins stepped through. He was shorter than had expected, reaching only to the middle of the High Commander's chest. His hair was gray at the temples, and deep lines marked his face like a map of hardships survived. But his eyes were sharp and clear, and when he extended his hand in what understood to be a human greeting, his grip was surprisingly strong. Collins introduced himself and then gestured to the woman standing beside him. This was Lieutenant Commander Lisa Tran, his second in command and the coordinator of their ground forces. She was smaller than Collins and younger, with black hair pulled back tight against her skull and a scar that ran from her left eyebrow to her jaw. She did not smile when she nodded at. Her eyes moved constantly, assessing the room, cataloging exits and potential threats. She had the look of someone who had seen violence and learned to live with it. Welcomed them to the staging grounds and expressed gratitude for their assistance. He tried to keep his voice neutral, but he could not entirely hide his doubt. Collins seemed to notice it, because a small smile crossed his weathered face. The commander said that he understood the High Commander's concerns. He acknowledged that 37 ships was not much of a fleet by galactic standards. He admitted that their technology was generations behind the Confederacy, but he asked to allow him a small demonstration before passing judgment. Agreed, curious despite himself. Collins led him through the corridors of the Defiant Hope, and the High Commander found himself revising his initial impressions. The ship was indeed old and battered on the outside, but inside it hummed with activity. Every system had been maintained with obsessive care. Every surface gleamed with cleanliness. The crew members they passed moved with purpose and precision, snapping to attention when their commander walked by. They reached a large cargo bay that had been converted into a staging area. 4,000 humans stood in perfect formation, their armor but polished, their weapons held at parade rest. They ranged in age from barely adult to seasoned veterans with gray in their hair. Men and women stood side by side, their expressions identical masks of discipline and readiness. Collins explained that these were the Marines of the United Earth Defense Force. They came from every nation on there, speaking dozens of languages, carrying the flags of countries that had once been enemies. But here, in the black between stars, they were one people. He said they called themselves different names depending on their branch and history. Some were soldiers, some were sailors, some traced their lineage to warriors who had fought in deserts and jungles and frozen wastelands. But tonight, they were united under one banner. Asked what banner that was. Collins smiled again, and this time there was something dark in it. He said that centuries ago, their enemies had called them devils, sons and daughters of hell itself. At first, it was meant as an insult, but humans had a habit of taking insults and wearing them as badges of honor, so they had embraced the name. They had become what their enemies feared most. Lieutenant Commander Tran stepped forward and began explaining their doctrine. She spoke of shock and awe, of overwhelming force applied at unexpected points. She spoke of infiltration and sabotage, of striking from shadows and vanishing before retaliation could come. She spoke of close-quarters combat, of fighting in trenches and buildings and corridors where superior technology meant nothing and only will and skill determined survival. Listened with growing interest. They had always favored precision warfare, fighting at range with sophisticated weapons and careful tactics. They had overwhelmed them with numbers and ferocity, closing to melee range where the advantages disappeared. These humans seemed to understand that vulnerability instinctively. He asked Collins how long his people had been fighting wars. Collins thought for a moment. He said that their written history went back about 6,000 years. They had been fighting wars for all of it. Every generation had its conflict. Every century had its horrors. They had fought with sticks and stones, with swords and spears, with guns and bombs and weapons that could crack the very atoms of the universe. They had killed each other by the millions, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for none at all. Found this horrifying, and he said so. Collins nodded. He agreed that it was horrifying, but he suggested that there might be value in that horror. His people had spent 6,000 years learning how to fight and die. They had made every mistake that could be made on a battlefield. They had learned from those mistakes, written them down, passed them to their children. War was in their blood, woven into their very cells. They hated it. Most of them, anyway, but they were very, very good at it. The High Commander looked out at the 4,000 humans standing in silent formation. They were so small, so fragile compared to the warriors they would soon face. But there was something in their eyes that reminded him of predators. They stood like creatures waiting to be unleashed, straining against invisible leashes. He began to understand why their enemies had called them devils. He told Collins that he hoped the humans would prove him wrong about them. Collins said that his people had been proving doubters wrong since they crawled out of the caves. One more skeptic was not going to stop them now. The attack on Prime came 3 days after the humans arrived. The colony world held nearly 2 million civilians and served as a critical supply hub for the entire sector. When the swarm appeared on the edge of the system, numbering over 500 vessels, knew that losing this world would effectively end the war. The combined fleet moved to intercept, warships forming their traditional defensive screens while the human vessels hung back at the rear. Admiral had insisted on this formation, arguing that the primitive human ships would only get in the way of proper naval tactics. Had reluctantly agreed, though he noticed that Commander Collins had accepted the assignment without protest. The human commander seemed almost amused by the arrangement. They attacked with their usual strategy of overwhelming numbers. Thousands of fighter craft swarmed toward the lines while their capital ships provided covering fire. The battle quickly devolved into chaos as the fleet tried to maintain formation against an enemy that fought like a living storm. Then the humans moved. Collins had not asked permission. He simply ordered his fleet forward, and the 37 battered ships broke from their position at the rear and accelerated directly into the heart of the swarm. Watched in horror as the human vessels plunged through the fighter screen, taking hit after hit but refusing to break formation. The Defiant Hope led the charge, its hull glowing red from multiple plasma impacts. Lesser ships would have disintegrated under such punishment, but the human vessel kept coming. Later learned that the humans had reinforced their ships with additional armor plating, sacrificing speed and maneuverability for the ability to absorb punishment that would destroy more sophisticated vessels. It was a crude solution, but effective. The human fleet carved a path through the swarm and emerged on the other side, battered but intact. They had drawn the attention of nearly a third of the fighters, pulling them away from the defensive lines. It was a suicide run that somehow was not suicide. But the real shock came on the surface of Prime. They had already landed ground forces in the capital city. Nearly 10,000 of their warriors were spreading through the streets, hunting civilians and overwhelming the local defense forces. The military doctrine called for orbital bombardment in such situations, sacrificing the city to deny it to the enemy. Was preparing to give that order when Lieutenant Commander Tran contacted him directly. She informed him that the human Marines were deploying. She asked him to hold his fire. Demanded to know what she meant by deploying. The city was overrun. Sending ground forces into that situation was not a rescue mission. It was mass suicide. Tran simply said that they were aware of the situation. Then she cut the communication. Watched through orbital sensors as 12 drop ships descended through the atmosphere and landed in the heart of the occupied city. 4,000 humans against 10,000 in close urban combat where the aliens held every advantage. He prepared to watch them die. Sergeant Park was among the first to hit the ground. He was 34 years old, born in a city called Chicago on the Human. He had been a Marine for 12 years and had seen combat on 4 different worlds. None of that had prepared him for the. They were nightmares made flesh, standing nearly 3 meters tall with exoskeletons that could deflect standard weapons fire. They had 4 arms, each ending in claws that could tear through body armor like paper. They fought with a coordination that suggested hive mind intelligence, moving as one organism with thousands of bodies. Park did not care. He had his orders: hold the line, protect the civilians, kill everything that was not human or. His squad of 12 Marines encountered their first patrol 2 blocks from the landing zone. Nearly 50 of the creatures, moving through a residential district and dragging screaming civilians behind them. Park did not hesitate. He gave the order to engage. The humans hit the patrol like a thunderbolt. They did not fight from cover like the did. They did not try to maintain distance from their enemies. They charged directly into the alien formation, rifles blazing, closing to hand-to-hand range before they could react. Corporal Danny was the first to take a serious wound. A plasma bolt caught her in the left shoulder, burning through her armor and scorching the flesh beneath. The pain was blinding, the kind of agony that should have dropped her where she stood. She kept fighting. She shifted her rifle to her right hand and continued firing, her teeth clenched against the screaming of her nerve endings. When her rifle ran dry, she dropped it and drew her combat knife. The blade was primitive by galactic standards, just steel and carbon fiber, but it punched through the gap in a warrior's exoskeleton like it had been designed for exactly that purpose. Because it had. Humans had been designing weapons to kill things bigger and stronger than themselves for their entire existence. Park watched bring down 3 more with just her knife before he pulled her back behind cover. Her face was pale from blood loss and shock, but her eyes were still clear. She told him she could keep fighting. He told her that was exactly why he was pulling her back. They needed her alive, not heroically dead. The battle for Prime lasted 8 hours. The humans advanced block by block, house by house, fighting in corridors and basements and burned-out buildings. They took casualties that would have broken any unit. They lost nearly 1,600 Marines, almost 40% of their ground forces. They did not retreat. They did not call for extraction. They did not stop. By the time the sun rose on the shattered city, the ground forces had been annihilated. Every single one. The humans had killed over 9,000 of the creatures, often in close combat where size and strength should have given the aliens an overwhelming advantage. Descended to the surface to see the aftermath with his own eyes. The streets were littered with corpses, many of them bearing wounds that could only have come from melee weapons. He found Sergeant Park sitting on a pile of rubble, his armor cracked and stained with alien blood, eating a ration bar like he was on a lunch break. The High Commander asked how this was possible. How had 4,000 humans defeated 10,000 in close combat? Park finished chewing and swallowed before answering. He said that they were bigger, stronger, and faster than humans. They had better natural weapons and thicker armor. In a fair fight, they would win every time. So the humans did not fight fair. They fought dirty. They fought mean. They fought like their lives depended on it because their lives did depend on it. He gestured to the alien corpses around them. He said that they had one big weakness. They expected their enemies to behave rationally, to retreat when wounded, to surrender when surrounded, to value their own survival above the mission. Humans did not work that way. Humans would keep fighting until they physically could not move anymore, and sometimes even after that. Looked at the young human and saw something that chilled him to his core. Park was not boasting. He was not proud. He was simply stating facts, the way one might describe the weather or the time of day. This was what humans were. This was what they had always been. The High Commander finally understood why their enemies had called them devils. 3 days after the Battle of Prime, High Commander summoned Commander Collins to his quarters aboard the Eternal Light. The leader had not slept since watching the humans fight. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images that made no sense to him. Wounded soldiers charging forward instead of falling back. Marines throwing themselves on warriors twice their size. A species that should have been nothing more than a footnote in galactic history, fighting like demons from the old stories. Collins arrived alone, as requested. He looked tired but alert, with new bandages visible beneath his uniform collar. He had been injured during the naval engagement, though he had refused to leave his post until the battle was won. Was beginning to understand that this was typical behavior for humans. The High Commander offered Collins a seat and poured him a glass of wine. Collins accepted both gracefully, though his expression suggested he knew this was not a social call. He waited for to speak first, his weathered face patient and unreadable. told Collins that he had spent the last 3 days trying to understand what he had witnessed. He had reviewed every piece of footage from the battle, consulted with his tactical advisors, and studied the casualty reports in exhaustive detail. None of it made sense according to any military doctrine that had ever developed. He pulled up a holographic display showing the ground battle statistics. The humans had lost nearly 40% of their ground forces. By every standard of galactic warfare, that level of casualties should have triggered an immediate withdrawal. No species could sustain such losses and continue fighting effectively. The psychological damage alone should have shattered unit cohesion and morale. Collins nodded slowly. He admitted that the losses were heavy. He said that every one of those Marines had a name, a family, a story that ended on Prime. He felt the weight of each death like a stone in his chest, and he would carry that weight for the rest of his life. Waited for the explanation he knew was coming. Collins took a sip of wine and began to speak. He said that humans had a concept that other species seemed to struggle with. They called it acceptable losses. It meant that sometimes the mission was more important than the lives of those carrying it out. It meant that commanders had to make choices that would haunt them forever, trading blood for objectives that might save more lives in the long run. The High Commander found this horrifying, and he said so. Collins agreed. He said it was horrifying. He said that any human who did not find it horrifying had lost something essential to their humanity, but he asked to consider the alternative. What would have happened if the Marines had retreated when casualties reached 30%? That would have completed their conquest of the city. 2 million civilians would be dead or worse. Sometimes the math was brutal, but it was still math. Argued that no civilization could survive such a callous approach to its own people. The psychological cost alone would destroy a species within generations. This was when Lieutenant Commander Tran entered the conversation. She had been standing outside the door, and Collins had apparently signaled for her to join them. She limped slightly as she walked, favoring her left leg where a claw had torn through her armor during the battle. Tran said that was right. The acceptable losses doctrine would destroy a species if that was all they had. But humans had something else, something that contradicted the first principle and somehow coexisted with it. She explained a concept called no one left behind. It meant that humans would go to extraordinary lengths to recover their fallen, even when doing so made no tactical sense. It meant that every Marine knew that their brothers and sisters would never abandon them, even in death. It meant that the acceptable losses were never truly acceptable, just necessary. Struggled to reconcile these two ideas. How could a species simultaneously accept sacrificing their own people and refuse to abandon them? Collins smiled sadly. He said that humans were complicated. They could hold contradictory ideas in their minds and believe both of them simultaneously. Some called it cognitive dissonance. Others called it faith. Whatever it was, it had kept humanity alive through 6,000 years of trying to kill itself. Tran pulled up her own holographic display, showing images and maps from human history. She told about a place called Thermopylae, where 300 warriors from a city called Sparta had held a narrow pass against an army of over 100,000. They knew they were going to die. They went anyway, because their deaths would buy time for their homeland to prepare its defenses. Every one of them fell, and their sacrifice became legend. She told him about a place called Bostonia, where human soldiers were surrounded by enemy forces during a conflict called the Second World War. When the enemy commander sent a message demanding their surrender, the human general replied with a single word that roughly translated to absolutely not. They held the town until reinforcements arrived, fighting through cold and hunger and overwhelming odds. She told him about a place called Wake Island, where a small garrison of humans held off an invasion force for 16 days, sinking enemy ships and shooting down enemy aircraft with weapons that were already outdated. When they finally fell, they had inflicted casualties that stunned their attackers. Collins took over the narrative. He told about Incheon, where humans launched an amphibious assault that military experts called impossible, landing troops behind enemy lines and turning the tide of a war. He told him about a place called, where Marines cleared a city block by block against enemies who knew every street and alley, taking casualties that would have broken lesser forces. Listen to story after story of human stubbornness, human sacrifice, human refusal to accept defeat even when defeat was the only logical outcome. He began to see a pattern emerging. Humans did not fight like other species because they did not think like other species. They did not calculate odds and make rational decisions based on probability of success. They simply decided what needed to be done and then did it, regardless of the cost. He asked Collins directly. He asked if humans were not afraid to die. Collins was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that of course they were afraid. Every human who had ever lived was afraid of death. It was hardwired into their biology, a survival instinct that had kept their species alive through countless dangers. But humans had learned to do something with that fear. They had learned to use it, to channel it into action rather than paralysis. He said that courage was not the absence of fear. It was being afraid and doing the thing anyway. Every Marine who charged into that city was terrified. Every pilot who flew into the swarm knew they might not come back. They felt the fear in their bones, in their guts, in every instinct that screamed at them to run. And then they told that fear to shut up and did their jobs. Tran added something that stuck with long after the conversation ended. She said that humans did not come to this war to win. Winning would be nice, of course. They would certainly try, but that was not why they came. Asked why they had come then. Tran looked at him with eyes that had seen too much death and had somehow found peace with it. She said they came because someone asked for help. That was all. The Confederacy had sent out a desperate plea to the galaxy, and humanity had answered. Not because they expected reward. Not because they thought they could succeed. Just because it was the right thing to do. Collins finished the thought. He said that where they came from, you answered the call. It did not matter if the odds were impossible. It did not matter if you were outnumbered. When someone needed help, you helped them. That was what made them human. Sat in silence for a long time after the two officers left. He thought about his own people, so advanced and sophisticated, who had refused to risk their own safety to help others in need. He thought about the humans, so primitive and fragile, who had crossed the galaxy to die for strangers. He began to wonder which species was truly civilized. The final battle came 6 weeks later, above the burning skies of Prime itself. They had committed everything they had to this assault, gathering a fleet of over 3,000 vessels for one massive strike at the heart of the Confederacy. If the fell, the war was over. There would be nothing left to defend. High Commander stood on the bridge of the Eternal Light and watched the swarm approach on his tactical display. His own fleet numbered just over 400 ships, bolstered by reinforcements from the outer colonies. The humans had 29 vessels remaining after the battles of the previous weeks. The math was simple and brutal. They were outnumbered more than 7-1. Commander Collins arrived on the bridge unannounced, his uniform crisp despite the exhaustion visible in his eyes. He had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the war began, and it showed in the new lines on his face and the gray spreading through his hair. But his eyes were still sharp, still carrying that strange fire that had come to associate with humanity. Collins asked to speak with the High Commander privately, led him to a small conference room adjacent to the bridge, where they could talk without being overheard. He had learned that humans preferred to discuss their most audacious ideas away from skeptical audiences. Collins pulled up a holographic map of the approaching fleet. He pointed to a massive vessel at the center of the formation, surrounded by layer upon layer of escorts and defensive ships. This was the Hive Mind command ship, the neural center that coordinated all forces within several light years. Intelligence suggested that destroying this ship would throw the entire swarm into chaos, reducing them from a coordinated army to a disorganized mob. Had already considered this option. He explained that the command ship was too well protected. Any attack force would be destroyed long before reaching it. The tactical computers had run thousands of simulations, and none of them showed a viable path to the target. Collins nodded. He said he knew. His own people had run the same simulations. Then he said that he had a plan that the computers had not considered because no rational species would ever attempt it. He proposed flying the human fleet directly into the heart of the swarm and punching through to the command ship. Not around it, not through gaps in the formation. Straight through the middle, absorbing whatever damage they could dish out and trusting that enough ships would survive to complete the mission. Stared at him, he said that was not a plan, that was suicide. Collins corrected him. He said it was sacrifice. There was a difference. He explained further. The human ships would draw the attention of the defensive forces, creating an opening for the fleet to engage the remaining enemy vessels on more favorable terms. Meanwhile, a strike team of Marines would board the command ship directly, fighting their way to the core and planting explosives that would destroy it from within. Asked what the expected casualties would be for this plan. Collins was quiet for a moment. Then he said honestly that he expected to lose most of his fleet, possibly all of it. The Marine strike team would almost certainly not survive, but if they succeeded, the war would effectively be over. The remaining forces would tear themselves apart without coordination, and the Confederacy would survive. The High Commander felt something twist in his chest. He had spent weeks fighting alongside these humans, watching them bleed and die for a people they had never met. And now their commander was calmly proposing to sacrifice everything they had left for one final roll of the dice. He asked Collins why. Why would humans give so much for strangers? Collins smiled, and for the first time saw something like peace in his expression. He said that someone had asked for help. That was the only reason they needed. The battle began at dawn time. The human fleet broke from formation and accelerated toward the swarm, their engines burning at maximum power. The Defiant Hope led the charge, its battered hull gleaming in the light of the sun. They responded exactly as expected, turning hundreds of ships to intercept the incoming threat. Plasma fire lit up the void as the human vessels entered weapons range, and the first casualties began almost immediately. The Iron Will took a direct hit to its engine section and fell out of formation, spinning helplessly into the dark. The Valiant Star exploded when a cruiser rammed it head-on. But the humans kept coming. They absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other fleet, their reinforced hulls holding together through impacts that should have torn them apart. And they gave back as good as they got, their weapons tearing through fighters and escorts with devastating precision. Sergeant Park led the Marine strike team, launching from the Defiant Hope in a single armored shuttle that threaded through the chaos of the battle. Corporal Danny sat beside him, her wounded arm still bandaged but her rifle clutched firmly in her good hand. 12 Marines against a ship crewed by thousands. It should have been impossible. They breached the command ship through a cargo bay, cutting through the hull with plasma torches, and fighting their way inside before they could seal the breach. The corridors were nightmare tangles of organic matter and technology, filled with warriors who fought with the desperation of creatures defending their queen. Park lost 3 Marines in the first 5 minutes, then 2 more at a junction where they had set up took another wound, this time to her leg, and had to be carried by her. They kept moving. They had no choice. Outside, the human fleet was dying. The Steadfast Courage went down with all hands when 4 cruisers caught it in a crossfire. The Night Wing sacrificed itself by ramming a carrier that was about to overwhelm the Defiant Hope. Commander Collins watched his ships fall one by one, each death another weight on his soul. But they had made it through. The command ship loomed ahead, its defenses thinned by the desperate battle. Collins ordered all remaining ships to concentrate fire on a single point, burning through the outer hull and creating an opening that the Marine shuttle had already exploited. Park and his remaining Marines reached the core with 4 people still standing. He, and 2 others whose names would be remembered for 10,000 years. The core itself was a pulsing mass of organic tissue and crystal matrices, protected by the last and largest warriors the sergeant had ever seen. The final fight was brutal and short. Park went down with a claw through his abdomen, but not before emptying his rifle into the creature that killed him. The other 2 Marines fell moments later, buying the time she needed to drag herself to the core. She was alone now, bleeding from a dozen wounds, her vision blurring at the edges. She could feel death reaching for her, cold fingers closing around her heart. She had maybe 30 seconds of consciousness left, 30 seconds to end a war. She planted the explosive charge with hands that shook from blood loss and exhaustion. She armed it with a voice command that came out as barely a whisper. Then she slumped against the core and waited for the end. Her last thought was that she hoped it had been enough. The explosion tore the command ship apart from the inside, a flowering of fire that consumed everything within 1,000 kilometers. The fleet went instantly mad, their coordination shattered, their ships turning on each other in confusion and rage. The fleet swept in and destroyed them by the hundreds, turning a desperate last stand into a decisive victory. In the aftermath, High Commander walked through the wreckage of the human fleet. Of 29 ships, 4 remained. Of 4,000 Marines, less than 300 had survived. Commander Collins was among the living, though he had lost an eye and most of his left hand to a plasma burst that had breached the Defiant Hope's bridge. The galaxy asked why. Why would such a young species sacrifice so much for strangers they barely knew? Collins answered the question at the memorial service, standing before a monument that listed the names of every human who had fallen. His voice was hoarse and broken, but his words carried across the silent crowd. He said that they came because someone asked for help. That was all. That was everything. Where they came from, you answered the call. You stood with those who needed you, even when standing meant dying. You fought for what was right, even when fighting was hopeless. He said that was what made them human. That was what would always make them human. The Confederacy awarded the humans their highest honors. They inscribed the names of the fallen on monuments that would stand for 10,000 years. And across the galaxy, a new saying spread among species who had once dismissed humanity as primitive and weak. If you need soldiers, call anyone. If you need devils, call the humans. They will come, they will fight, and they will never ever stop. Fidelis, always faithful until the end.